Well, it's a joy here at Calvin University today to welcome distinguished guest, Professor Uzee Brown from Morehouse College. Welcome to Calvin, your first trip to Grand Rapids.
Thank you, John.
Yeah.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, it's an honor to have you here.
I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah. Love to have a conversation today about curating this remarkable tradition, legacy, African-American spirituals. Wonder if we could talk a little bit about your journey, learnings along the way. And wonder if we could start with your engagements with Wendell Whalum at Morehouse.
Sure. Well, let me begin by saying, probably without exception, Wendell Whalum was the most impacting person on my career and the direction that I took at Morehouse. I actually began at Morehouse with the intention of being a biology pre-med major. And I had a cousin who sang in the Morehouse Glee Club, who was from my little town in Cowpens, South Carolina. And I saw him on TV when the Glee Club sang for Martin Luther King's funeral. And I admired my cousin very much, and I said, wow, I've never heard a male singing group, especially a group of African-American males, sing like that. And I have to see what this group is about when I get to Morehouse. So in my very first week as a freshman, I went to Dr. Wendell Whalum and I said, shyly, I wanted to try out for the Glee Club. And he said, sure, son, where you from? And I said, Cowpens. He said, oh my Lord, there are two of you from Cowpens. For him, that was the humor. But I sang and he said, you really have a fine talent. What do you plan to do with this? And at that time, I had no idea. I just wanted to sing. He said, well, okay, you're in, here's the schedule, and don't be late. And that persisted for the entirety of the time that I knew Wendell Whalum, a real stickler for time. But because of the kinds of probing questions he would ask, and also the engaging things that he would do in rehearsal and whatnot, I just became completely drawn into wanting to be more engaged in that area of work. I found it fascinating, and I also found him to be a very compelling person in a lot of ways, bigger than life personality, and he made it come home to you in ways that I think for me, coming from a small little town in South Carolina, Cowpens, was eye-opening. Let me tell you, Wendell Whalum was such a luminary in the sense of his relationship with other major musicians across the country, that in my freshman year, and largely because of the influences of the King funeral and those people who'd seen the Glee Club, many for the first time ever, there were many invitations that came to the Glee Club. But I had the good fortune in my freshman year to join the Glee Club. He selected me, a freshman, about which I was very pleased, to go on a tour in the spring that was to New York, and it was for the second International Choral Festival under the direction of Maestro Robert Shaw. And I didn't know who Shaw was at that time, but all I knew was there were these places that I'd only heard the names of that I was going to go. Lincoln Center, and then Carnegie Hall, and Town Hall, and these were just places that I never thought I would see, but to be able to go to these places in my freshman year, it was magical. And so it drew me in because I realized how much tremendous value there was in terms of interacting with an audience and the feedback we got. And Wendell Whalum was a person who had audacity. He would do things that were daring. Here we are at the International Choral Festival with choirs from 16 countries around the world. They were all selected from their countries to represent. And he decided that spontaneously we need to do something that lifts up some kind of unity because we all speak different languages, we're from different places. Let me warm this crowd up, so to speak. And he broke into a couple of songs that were rather easy, but I remember vividly the most significant was the singing of We Shall Overcome. And it seems that everybody from every country knew that. And then at a point, it got to where each choir was singing a verse of this in their own language. And it just rotated around, and Robert Shaw joined in this massive circle of all of these choirs, and it was just a moving experience. But we sang at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., and I had the fortunate opportunity to meet a guy who is legend at Howard University, which was a premier HBCU institution in the D.C. area. His name was Warner Lawson, and he conducted at the National Cathedral, as did Shaw, of course, in New York and at Lincoln Center during the Stravinsky Symphony of Psalms. And this was all during my freshman year.
Oh.
And so it was...
What a way to start.
yeah.
And you became a music major, I take
I
it.
did indeed.
Okay.
Actually, I took a few theory courses. And here's the other thing that really, this gets to why I've chosen to do what I do. Wendell Whalum said, "Do you realize the treasure that you have from Calpian's young man?" And I was like, no. But there were things in my background that I had known and things that I had heard all my life. And I did not understand their place in terms of the African-American sacred music experience. And he helped me not only to realize that, but to give it context. I had some wonderful teachers in theory and whatnot that allowed me to explore them and understand them from the perspective of the pedagogy behind how these things fit into the framework of other kinds of musical materials. And it then, as a result of being able to do that, you realize the uniqueness of it. Because when you look at it against other kinds of things that have been done, it stands out as something very special in terms of the African-American folk music, heritage folk music tradition. Yeah.
What are some examples of music that you recall from that South Carolina heritage that you've had a chance to go back and curate and bring to life?
Well, I certainly, a couple of them were so important to me as a child because they were ones that my parents sang. Traveling Shoes. I always found it fascinating because my mother and father would do it in the kind of dialogue that was almost like a little scenario, a Shana, a play, because there are different characterizations there, you know. Death comes knocking at the door, talks to the sinner, "Are you ready to go?" "No, no, 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 because I ain't put on my traveling shoes." And it goes on around to the Christian. So it was as much fun as it was a message in this, you know, until he gets to the Christian who says, you know, "I'm ready to go." He bent down and he buckled his shoe. And so Traveling Shoes was one of them. But another one that became very important and remained so up to this day, it still is important in terms of my work, was "I'm Building Me a Home."
Right. Yeah.
When I sang that really on a bus trip with Dr. Whalum, he said, "That is the most wonderful tune. You need to write that down." And I wrote it down. And, you know, at that time I was just really beginning to become really facile with manuscripting and doing things of this sort. But I captured it enough to be able to recall it and a few years later and built a spiritual arrangement for TTBB Voices around that. Benjamin Elijah Mays heard it, and he was immediately moved by it and said, "Oh, this reminds me so much of home." Well, he was born right down the road from me in 96, South Carolina. I'm from Cowpens. And he wanted it everywhere he was that we were, which was fantastic for me. Dr. Whalum never knew this, but I heard him on a phone conversation. There was that piece and another piece called "Sweet Clean Mary." And he found that fascinating because it represents scripturally several different Marys that are discussed in this same spiritual in various sections. And he was having a conversation with Walter Gould at Lawson Gould Publishing Company, who he had been directed to speak with about my music by Robert Shaw. And I stopped at the doorway because I heard him discussing my pieces, and he was saying, and his writing is solid, and his voicing is good, and he deserves, you really need to look at this music. And he never knew, because I just walked away, but he never knew that I heard that conversation. But that was the result of the first published pieces that I had. The first and second pieces were "Sweet Clean Mary," and the second, "I'm Building Me a Home." Some people think I did "I'm Building Me a Home" for Spike Lee's movie School Days. Well, it turns out that Spike was a student at Morehouse, and he heard that piece, in one of the chapel services. As a matter of fact, I was the one singing it, and he said, I have to have this piece in the movie. So I really did it more because of Dr. Whalen's indulgence and the fact that Benjamin Mays appreciated it, and then ultimately Spike wanted to use it as the prologue in the movie School Days.
Amazing story. Wow. What did you learn in all of that about what it takes to arrange one of these spirituals well, with that kind of love and attentiveness? A lot of learning goes into that.
I had a lot of conversations over 19 years with Wendell Whalem, who would insist that we go into certain churches and communities, and he'd call and it was interesting, he would always ask this rhetorical question, what are you doing? And it didn't matter what I said. Good, well, let's go to blank, blank, blank. We need to go here, and we would go, and this is where I began to collect melodies and whatnot. But in terms of writing the spiritual, he said the one thing that you must always remember is that no matter how much one aggrandizes the spiritual for the concert presentation, at the root of it, there's a profound message that was functional music and not simply for diversion or entertainment as a concert performer, and you have to capture that. And if you violate the integrity of that, then you begin to put yourself in the way of the message. And so I've always been sensitive to that. So a lot of the arrangements that I've done, I've tried to stick as close as I can. Obviously, you want musical creativity, but to a theme that resonates importantly in terms of the theological implications of these spirituals.
And what have you learned about inviting students, especially, into the depth of these texts?
Sure.
And what advice would you have for other conductors, musicians, pastoral leaders about really digging deep into that meaning that you described so beautifully?
Sure. I think it's important, and I have mentored many students, several who are really very prominent now themselves. I'm delighted to be on a panel at the coming American Choral Directors Association with one of my former students, Dr. Brandon Waddles, completed his PhD at Florida State University, and he is the actual principal in this panel discussion. But I can recall Brandon coming and saying, Dr. Brown, will you look at this? Tell me what you think. And there are a number of things that I could say on that. First, and it begins with the text, you have to make sure that you're setting them in such a way that you bring significance to the important words that cause the text to come to life. The second and equally important thing is never underestimate the profundity of what may seem to be a simple message on the surface. That was the same mistake that was made by the slave owners during the days of slavery, when they failed to understand the multiple layers of dialogue that were taking place in these simple songs. This is why they became a convenient vehicle for the double meaning kinds of songs. At one level, it had a spiritual context, and at another, it had a very strong social message in an environment where they were prohibited to be able to communicate effectively with each other. So just don't write it off as kind of, mindless and simple poetry of some kind from uneducated people. A gross underestimation, I think.
Absolutely. Are there a few spirituals in particular that you wish could be sung more, recovered, that the world would take a second look at because of the power of the message underneath?
Yeah, they are indeed. I think really one of the most masterful writers of the spiritual was Hall Johnson. And there are a number of the Hall Johnson spirituals that have, fallen by the wayside. He was one of the most prominent, as you well know, composer arrangers at the turn of the century, from the 19th to 20th century. And had some really wonderful arrangements of spirituals. Some of them were sort of designed for the Hollywood thing, that he did that Green Crescent and whatnot, but others were just really extremely carefully written, I think, with such an in-depth understanding of idiomatic expression Hall Johnson does that better than I think most African-American composers of that age that I know. Burley's spiritual arrangements tended to be more artful, beautifully set, but crafted more for the stage of the classical performer, though Burley himself was very engaged in church music. But that is certainly, Hall Johnson's spirituals are ones that the solos, although, by the way, the solo spirituals came back in a publication that Eugene Simpson, his biographer and one of his proteges, actually put together. And I was so happy for that, because the difficulty was trying to find those spirituals and dig them and unearth them. Another's are Nathaniel Dett. Oh, what tremendous writing. Skillful composer in the sense of being able to manipulate a simple melody. I always enjoyed studying Beethoven because you dealt with the issues of the economy of means, starting with some germ of an idea and building it. Well, he knew how to do that. And the Chariot Jubilee, which we are now exploring with my group, the Choraleers, is fascinating. He understood the abilities of the composer to not only manipulate some of the traditional Western European constructs, but also how to take advantage of things like diminutions of rhythms and augmentation to highlight a melody in a way that you didn't even realize it was back until you were about halfway through it and realized, oh, there's that melody again. And the Chariot Jubilee is really built pretty much around the simple tune, Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. But those are, two of the
I'd love to hear a bit about the mission of the Choraleers, Uzee Brown Society of Choraleers that you direct, and what your hopes and dreams for that group continue to be, and the mission that you're working on together.
Well, that group was organized because we were asked to perform a composition that was based upon the writings of Philip Makowitz, who was a survivor, one of the last of the survivors of the terrible prison camps in Germany. And he was only a small child, but he had scribbled things down with, I think, some charred bark, the carbon from the bark that he had retained all those years, and the scraps that he'd kept in his pockets. And he was such a fascinating man to meet. But one of my former teachers from the University of Michigan, Burton Bierman, wrote a composition entitled Tikva, which means hope. And it was a multi-sectional piece. It would be what one would call a mixed media composition, because it had film, it had an instrumental ensemble, and a variety of things, and it also had a chorus. And he asked me if I would prepare the chorus for that. And one of the reasons is because the parallel of the dilemma of the Jewish people in the Holocaust was not unlike the dilemma of the African American, and not only the slave, but the South African situation and so forth. And what happens in the videography of this thing is that it moves through various films that are by way connected to body sync, so the dancer moves to the images and the colors on the film. Really creative piece. But there are these parallels of scenes of oppression. You would have one that was from the Holocaust, another from the burnings in South Africa, another from the antebellum days of slavery, and so forth. And looking at oppression, wherever it may be, one of the pieces we sang was that, why is it that man treats his fellow man who is weaker so bad? That's just simply, that's the message. What is it about human nature that seems to give us the prerogative, or to assume prerogative, to take advantage of someone who is weaker? And it was the result of that recording project that we came together. These were former members of my choirs from the several places where I did church work, Van Hill United Methodist Church, Cascade, Ebenezer for almost 13 years. And we were all excited to come together. And part of that mission was just the joy of coming together and singing, but to do something that elevated an awareness of music that was not as often heard in our communities as should be. And there was certainly room for that.
So it strikes me there's a prophetic side to that kind of music making and a healing side to that. I mean, these two powerful, I mean, the piece that you describe, how hauntingly compelling that is. That's, that's not just arts as decorative, it's arts with a powerful cultural.
Precisely. I say that always, and that's a word that I use and I used early, functional music. Because functional music is an expression of life. It is not something that is an intellectual opining, something that one does simply as an exercise to flex his intellectual muscles and to sit and perhaps wander off in leisure time into, it's all right, into Elysian fields. And okay. But in reality, music is a reflection of life, and I tell my students always, be careful that you do not use an aesthetic definition for music. It's not something that's pleasant or beautiful, pleasing to the ear. It can be provocative, it can be violent, it can be all of these things that are part of the human experience and our emotions. And it is the intention to capture that brings life to it, because the performer is really a recreator. And if the composer does not create something that becomes this instrument through which the performer is able to recreate and then deliver to a listening audience, something in that has not been successful.
I'd love to ask you a little bit about music in the church. As I hear you talk, this powerful connection between folk music, art music, but then church music. And how over the years of your performing, arranging, what do you think are the kind of unique gifts of music in the church, and what are some of the challenges that you really would love for the next generation to pay attention to?
Well, let me tell you, first of all, I'm very much anchored to music in the church because, as I mentioned before, that is where I began. I've written compositions for all kinds of mediums and for all kinds of purposes. But that understanding of what had been part of my own background was directly related to music in the church. That's where I had heard it. That's where I had experienced it, to know something about it in the sense of what it can mean as therapy, as a kind of balm for things in life that don't go right. That's why I always really appreciated the power of the sorrow song. And when you hear those kinds of things, they are real in the sense that they don't serve as vehicles for entertainment. And everywhere I've gone where I've done church work, I've tried to indicate, yes, there is a role that a church choir plays and the church musician that is partly intended to provide some enrichment and, I dare say, some entertainment. But if that is all that you have, then again, the bucket is certainly close to empty. There has to be a message, because you're talking about something that has its place in the worship experience. And if it fails to meet that mandate as worship music, then it is perhaps questionable as whether it should be included into that context. So I'm very careful about that. And the other side of it is, I've written there have been two primary sources for many of the things that I've written. One of them has been because of the particular church or the particular choir that I was working with. So you will see at the top of a lot of my music, written for whatever the Ebenezer Baptist Church, the Peniel Baptist Church, and then the other is from my students or personal friends who had particular needs or something that they would want. Because in that way, I see, I visualize, I hear the body for whom I'm writing, and it makes it easier for me to write because it's a targeted kind of performance environment that I'm trying to capture there.
Could you say a bit about the work that you've published through GIA Publications? And I know that gets into many audiences, schools, universities, but also many churches there, and say a little bit about the vision for that work that you've had.
Well, you know what, the GIA has been a tremendous blessing in a lot of ways because of the fact that it has done as much as it has to nurture music with the name GIA. I think you might know what the original meaning of those letters was. It was Gregorian Institute of America. Well, let's move way from Gregorian to anything, and happily so, because they really have done a great job of not only dealing with music that comes from certain kinds of cultural influences, but also for graded levels for kids. I've had the wonderful opportunity to serve on committees dealing with appropriate pieces for smaller kids in the context of things that are used for pedagogical purposes in teaching, whether it's choral music or solo music for the voice or for the piano. So to have the Morehouse Choral Series come out of that, I'm immensely proud. Before that series, however, I was engaged with GIA with my own work. A lot of those pieces were because of conferences, high schools, and so forth, where they wanted the music, and GIA was diligent enough to say, well, we're going to get it out. What's the date? What is the deadline? And it happened. You know, I mean, it matters when you're selling a few thousand copies, you know, and it's a large conference. And so that is how some of them came into being, because they were pieces that were needed for certain kinds of conferences. But a lot of them were because of that dimension of church and church music. Jimmy Abington, Dr. Jimmy Abington, whom I'm sure you know, has did a masterful job of sort of shopping these things around churches across the country in a way that allow church musicians to realize these pieces are accessible. And accessibility is an important word in terms of GIA's work. It has done things that, you know, if you look at it on paper, it sometimes looks far more difficult and challenging. And you realize when you hear it, oh my God, this is something I do every week. But it's been that kind of thing that has allowed it to circulate more broadly. But the Morehouse series, though, it was intended to represent a kind of a higher offering of music with some greater challenges to the depth of one's opining, not something that is as accessible as what you would want for a service. You don't want to, how should I say it, inundate a person with having to delve too far into intellectual pursuit in a worship service. But outside of that, sometimes it's a healthy thing to be able to sit and ponder and consider things that are perhaps a greater extension of one's thought process than that which is simply existential.
And all that, both arms of that work, creating space for younger composers and arrangers to sort of participate in this larger legacy too, right? I mean, there's a lot of different voices there. And,
young composers, absolutely diverse in the sense that there are as many original compositions as there are arrangements. And I think that is an extremely important thing that needs to be the next leg of where we go. More needs to be done to nurture the output of young composers. There's a joke about people becoming so caught up in this sort of conservative paradigm of what is good music that one of my friends put it, well, unfortunately, the piece is not going to survive because the composer hasn't been dead long enough.
Oh, right, right. Yeah, right.
But that is unfortunate because it does not, that attitude doesn't make room for these younger people with some wonderful ideas, even in terms of the setting of the spiritual, which is something that I've often talked about. It can be creatively done without losing its basic flavor and intention.
When you look at today's Morehouse students, if you were to really give them a call, a mandate, a challenge, something you'd love to really see them live deeply into, what would you say?
I would probably say to them that they should work toward realizing something that becomes a greater global impact on spirituality and on a kind of cultural unity that I see dwindling, sadly, too far from the pale. We are not in the place where there is common cause, even among people who are, African Americans, because the communities have been decentralized in a way that you don't have this core kind of community and the same idea of spiritualism and the same inherent standards of good and humanism. And somewhere that pendulum has to swing back closer to center. And it's not simply the United States. How one can look at on the news in any given time, devastating invasions and murder, and then look at gang violence and so forth, and enjoy their meal and not be disturbed, tells me that there is a desensitizing in terms of our basic human nature. And something has to happen there. If they can find a creative dimension of expression through music to make those things happen, I think it will not only speak volumes for them, but it will make this world a better place.
Indeed. If I may, I would love to ask you yet a word about this remarkable moment several years ago where you were asked to write an arrangement of We Shall Overcome, Atlanta Symphony.
Yeah.
What an amazing piece. Could you bring us back to that, what that experience was like for you?
Sure.
That opportunity and invitation.
Yeah, well, I must tell you, my wonderful colleague, Dr. David Morrow, who has really been singly the most important figure in terms of my writing for men's voices, had an influence on that. And he basically said, this is something that you should talk to Dr. Brown about doing, because he's at Ebenezer, he knows the family, can do this, that, and the other. And it was Ben Rowe at National Public Radio who says, let me ask him and see if he's willing to take on the project. And it was really a short timeline because they did not have a central musical work that was sort of the highlight of the celebration. And so he said, I want something that is emblematic of Martin Luther King's whole mission and whatnot. And We Shall Overcome, what is more iconic than that? But I don't want a simple strophic setting of the freedom hymn. I want something that is a more elaborate and broader kind of musical expression, but that uses that as a basis. And so that was an interesting challenge that was given to me. It was for Martin Luther King's 70th birthday celebration. And I accepted it for two reasons. One of them is because I was at Ebenezer. I've been very close to members of the King family for a very long time. I just did an interview with Bernice 2 days ago down at the Cobb Energy Center in Atlanta. And we talked about her mother and her family and the tremendous impact, which a lot of people don't know, that she had on music and freedom and the place of African Americans, even in terms of integrating the symphony halls and whatnot. But I thought, this is an opportunity to say something musically here and perhaps elevate this simple but powerful freedom song to a level that resonates in broader circles. And so I got to work, and I had to work fast, as I said, because the timeline was short. And I stayed up late nights and pulling together these themes, but I ultimately decided I'm going to merge this hymn with another spiritual. I ain't got weary yet, because this is 70 years, and we're still on the journey. We are not at the end of the road. And so that is why I chose to use what you will hear at the beginning of this work in the Shali, da-dee-dum-bee. That's the theme. I ain't got weary yet. I've been on this journey a mighty long time, and I ain't got weary yet. So I used those, I juxtaposed that melody with We Shall Overcome in a way that was, in terms of its compositional construct, one that elevated it to a work worthy of the symphony orchestra. And it was, in fact, commissioned by National Public Radio to be performed by the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra. To date, it's been performed about 22 symphony orchestras across the country, and it's done at some places on a yearly basis. So it's had a good deal of success, and it was heard across the world by more than 400 radio stations. So,
what did it mean to the Ebenezer church family and to the King family? Do you have a sense of the conversations back there when that piece was sung?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Mrs. King was living then. She was there. This is Coretta. Mrs. Christine King Ferris was, the whole family was there. It was a high celebration, first of all, because the symphony had done something that it continued for many, many years, and that was the tradition of building something around the King celebration that could be represented in a way by the orchestra for the community, which I think was fantastic. The place was packed. And they were immensely proud, and I have in my house right now a poster with the names of the other composers and whatnot, but I had the pleasure of writing that piece as the central piece for this celebration. And one of the big reasons they were so proud is because I was director of the Ebenezer Choir, and they not only sang a section on that concert, but they were part of the 5 choirs that did this, including Morehouse and Spelman Glee Clubs. So it was a huge chorus with the full orchestra, and it was done in the Martin Luther King Jr. International Chapel before it was done at Symphony Hall.
Amazing. Now, at Ebenezer, you were a successor to his mother at one point, wasn't she? Not?
No, she had. There were several people after that, but she
in
had
that long line.
Yes, absolutely. It was a line of succession of a choir that she had conducted. Absolutely right, and had the pleasure of being delightful. Absolutely delightful. Really a very down-to-earth, wonderful family. I think much of Martin Luther King's this jovial and down-to-earth nature was so much a part of who his mother was. She was just a delightful person to know. And I have enjoyed knowing that family, and not because of their iconic place in terms of the freedom, but just because in terms of a part of the Ebenezer family. They are just members who come and worship. Mrs. Coretta Scott King was there every Sunday. She was in town. It was predictable where she would sit, and she didn't fail to take the opportunity to come up if she enjoyed something particularly musically, because she was classically trained at New England Conservatory, and really changed her career goals because of having married Martin Luther King, which is what Dr. Bernice King and I discussed. I am doing the lectures for the pre-performances of Porgy and Bess with the Atlanta Opera, and she joined me on Sunday night, and we had a dialogue about that. Wow. But her mother was singly responsible for actually integrating the audiences for the Metropolitan Opera that came every year to Atlanta for a week of opera, and it was sponsored by one of the local musical groups there. But she said, there are just not enough Black faces here. Where did they get this? And I will tell you, one of the early days for me, I got to see performances of some of the big stars of the Metropolitan Opera. Because of those kinds of changes, as a result of this, they allowed Blacks from the colleges and whatnot to usher. And once we had ushered, the whole thing was that you were allowed to take any seat that you could find that was open in the house and enjoy the opera. And that perhaps would not have happened if she had not been so insistent and persistent. Hey, same thing with the King Center. It was her continuance of that legacy. That
you might have set the record, though, as the fastest route from an usher to a performer. Am I right about that? Am I right about that?
To some extent, that is correct. Yeah.
Good.
Well, Howard Thurman used to say, I think in some earlier conversation I mentioned it, make what you hunger for real, nothing can stop you then. And I used to try to see myself on the stage, and but it happens, you feel like, okay, something here has, come to fruition for me. Yeah.
Thank you so very much